The Marvel Snap devs went absolutely nuts for the March cards. As always, these are only data mined versions of these cards. I felt like they were so ridiculous that I really wanted to talk about them now, though. Hope Summers is the Season Pass card. She's a 3/3, and when you play a card onto her lane, you get +1 energy for that next turn. Now, what does that actually mean? Well, there are two major ways I envision this card going. Fundamentally, this card looks to me like a lockjaw that any deck can run, basically. So, for example, you have the Hope Summers into play a card there on 4, into Doctor Doom there on 5. Very exciting kind of lines there. Ramping out 6 drops on 5. Proven winning strategy. A lot of things you can do with that. Then there's the more in-depth Hope Summers deck. So, for example, you focus on getting extreme bursts of energy. You play things like Silk, Jeff, Nightcrawler, and you can see how a deck begins to take shape in your mind. In addition to that, there's things like a high roll Hope Summers deck. For example, like I said, we did the Lockjaw comparison. What if you're playing her in something like High Evo Lockjaw? You play Hope Summers and Wasp, you get that 5 energy on your turn 4, start playing 5 drops into there, get that 6 energy on your turn 5. You kind of see where this is going, right? You go like Hope Summers, Wasp, Vision, Doctor Doom, doing some pretty ridiculous stuff. Now, this card was actually nerfed from where it originally where it originally was data mined at, and if you can believe it, it was giving 2 energy. So, shout out to the devs for playing around with that concept for however long it took for them to realize that giving 2 energy every time you played a card there was very stupid. As is, I think Hope Summers is still just a very strong card. And I think that like the ceiling on a card like this is so high, and the amount of decks she could possibly go in is also very large. Like this is the kind of card that like almost every mid-range deck that is playing Doctor Doom is interested in. And I also think that like this is the kind of card that some sort of combo decks are interested in. Thanos is interested in. Anything that can afford to play move cards in it is interested in. And basically, a lot of decks are going to want to be playing Hope Summers. As a season pass card, I look at her in the same vein as a Miss Marvel. I don't necessarily know if she'll be as game breaking as Miss Marvel was, but I do sort of see her as like okay, there are very few good 3 drops, and she immediately becomes one of the best in slot. One of the interesting things about her, though, is I almost feel like they could do whatever they want with her power, and it won't really impact her at all. Like, if they released this card with this text at a 3/2, it would be about as playable as it is as a 3/3. And if they released it as a 3/4, it would still be about as playable as it is as a 3/3. So I do think it's interesting that, like, I don't feel as though this card has very many balance levers to get worse, right? Like, when you do something like this, when you make a card like this, the comparison I want to make is to Zabu, where it's like really hard to make it a lot worse without just nuking it out of the entire game, right? Like, this reminds me almost of the progression Zabu went through. It's just they didn't release it with the number 2 in the text box, and so they got to that before it ever actually came out. That would have been the OG Zabu. This reminds me of fixed Zabu. Just it's a 3-drop, so maybe it's a little worse, but it's also more flexible. I think this card is just excellent. And I think the lack of competition at 3 is really, really, really sticking out when you have a card like this coming out. Like, look at Corvus Glaive, and then look at this, and then tell me which one of them is going to be doing its thing more. It just seems very clear that this is a card that will end up being one of the best in slot 3 drops in the entire game. I would be pretty surprised if that did not happen. Next up is Pixie, a 2/1 with a unique on-reveal text. Shuffle the costs of all the cards in your deck that started there. Now, when Pixie was data mined, she was probably the scariest card that they had here, and that's including Hope Summers giving 2 energy. Pixie's original text did not have the clause that requires their cards to start in your deck, meaning she was just a Thanos card. You would be playing a bunch of ridiculous Thanos stuff. In addition, she was also just a 1/3, which is ridiculous for a positive effect. As this iteration of Pixie, I think she's a lot more balanced, and I'm actually on the fence as to whether or not she'll be good at all. The dream here is you want her to be a Mr. Negative type card. This is a Mr. Negative with lower payoff, but the deck isn't as clear, but also you can play it a lot earlier and get more turns of that payoff. Another thing that this deck wants to be doing is playing its own Mobius and Mobius. Mobius totally removes Pixie's downsides, and that means that Pixie can get all upside. Your 1 cost 6 drop, that's still going to cost 1, but your 6 cost 1 drop, that's also going to cost 1. So Pixie plus Mobius does seem to be the direction this kind of deck is going, which already puts it in a different sort of category from Mr. Negative, which is very focused on not really interacting with your opponent. But if you're playing Pixie and Mobius, suddenly it's like, oh, well, maybe I can just like put this in a Sarah deck and see what happens. Like that is, I think, going to be the interesting deck building question with Pixie. The obvious things to do with her don't work because of that clause. You can't just throw her in Thanos Lockjaw. You can't just throw her in her Jane Foster deck where you like, well, I guess you can throw in her Jane Foster deck. It just has to be Wasp Yellow Jacket, and it can't be, Thor Beta Ray Bill, because the hammers won't actually get affected by her effect. But you can probably still do Wasp Yellow Jacket Jane with this card. That would be kind of interesting to see how that works out. I think that mostly my instincts with this card is that it went from an enormous problem that they should never release to a card that I actually think is a little bit underpowered. Now, maybe I'm off base here. Maybe that this is something that I'm missing. It does seem like the kind of card that will only really show its true power once decks are made around it, once people figure out what works, when people figure out what lines up into a given metagame. And I get that. Like, this is definitely a bit like looking at Mr. Negative and being like, well, I don't understand how that's good, before you actually understand, okay, we're going to do Iron Man, we're going to do Mystique, we're going to do some Wong stuff some of the time, like, before you get it, right? So, having not seen any Pixie decks, I do feel instinctively like this is a little bit worse than the other cards in this cohort in this month, but it is just so exciting and so unique. And the range of outcomes is so wide. Like, maybe I have the median outcome at like a 4 out of 10, but the range is anywhere from like 1 out of 10 to 10 out of 10. This could be one of the worst cards they ever release, or it could be one of the best cards they ever release. The range on this card, having not played with it, is very hard to gauge, and I feel like it's so wide. This could be an immensely powerful game breaker, or it could be kind of mid. I do worry that if it is sort of hard capped by the existence of opposing Mobii, because those opposing Mobii sort of turn off what your deck is trying to do entirely, make it so this card didn't matter. But there is a world where it's like, you know what else gets turned off by opposing Mobii? Zabu, right? Like, how bad is it actually? I'm really interested in this card. The range on it is huge. My instincts are telling me it won't be that good thanks to the clause that they added, preventing it from being run with Thor, Beta Ray Bill, and, of course, Thanos. Next up is Mockingbird, who is a card that I think is absolutely phenomenal. This is so up my alley, and it would be one of my favorite card releases they've ever done if it weren't for one specific card. So the exact reason that Pixie does not work with Thanos is a reason why Mockingbird does work with Thanos. And that is, God, everything is helping Thanos. Like, can we stop? Is there a world where we can just like write Infinity Stones don't count on this card? Because if Infinity Stones don't count on this card, I could wax poetic about how I want to play it in Zoo for probably 3 minutes. In fact, I'm going to do that anyway. We're going to talk about Zoo first, and then we're going to talk about Thanos. Because, like, I'm really excited for Zoo, and I'm really hoping they just, like, slap some text on here that says, Infinity Stones don't count as not starting in your deck. I hate it. I am very interested in how this card interacts with things like Shauna, with things like Squirrel Girl. Yes, Khazar would be in the deck. Because that deck has gotten some stealth buffs recently. We have Black Swan, we have Corvus, or Cull Obsidian, I did it again, and that kind of thing is actually pretty compelling to me. Like, Squirrel Girl discounting this, legitimately interesting. Shauna discounting this by 3, legitimately interesting. Buffing your stuff with Blue Marvel, very good. You have Kyera to protect your ones, there are some legitimate things you can be doing in terms of generating cards and putting them on the board. I know a lot of people are going to look at this and be like, oh, okay, we can put this in Loki. And it probably goes there too, because Loki is still doing some of those things, but I don't think it goes there as easily as you might think. Obviously, if it's in your hand when you Loki, that sucks. It's good to draw that after you Loki. It's going to be like pretty much a free 9 power. And that use case does seem pretty plausible to me, but a lot of the time, you're not actually going to be playing as many created cards as you think because they're pretty expensive. It might move more towards like Maria Hill type stuff, but generally, my thought process with this is a zoo card, unless it's a Thanos card, right? And as a zoo card, I mean, like, we've seen the power of Scar plus Shang-Chi, and Mockingbird plus Shang-Chi is not that far off. Now, Zoo is a deck that has a lot of competition and an obvious Predator and Killmonger, but I am interested in how far this deck can actually get pushed, because that's the profile of the kind of deck that could get the help and be good, but not be overpowered because of the obvious counterplay that exists to it. I am interested in this card. I am interested in playing it in Zoo, alongside maybe Cull Obsidian. I am interested in playing Squirrel Girl. I am interested in playing Shauna. Like, I know it seems underpowered, but this is the kind of thing that turns those cards from 4 out of 10s to 4 out of 10s that absolutely cheat energy, which is a way better thing to be. I'm already sort of formulating it in my head, right? You go like a Zabu, Khazar, Cull Obsidian, Mockingbird, Shang-Chi, and then one drops and Shauna, and then suddenly you're like, that's a deck, right? Like, you're doing something there. Like, that's a lot of power, some reasonable interaction, and some energy cheat, and suddenly that's a similar profile to like a bounce deck. That starts to look like a bounce deck in terms of what it's doing and how it's doing it and the amount of interaction it can afford to play. Like, this is starting to actually look compelling to me, and I think that's a good thing. All right, let's snap back to reality for a moment. This is a Thanos card. Let's be real. It ends up being roughly, 2 or 1, 9. That's really good. You pull it off of Lockjaw. That's really good. The only thing that could convince me this isn't a Thanos card is that it doesn't discount Scar, and that's pretty much it. But your 5s are already so mid that you can absolutely afford to run a 5/9 that ends up free. And it's like, oh, it didn't discount Scar. Who cares? It's a 5/9. It's free. This is a Thanos card. It's going to make Thanos a lot better. And I got to tell you, I am very glad they changed Pixie, because if they released Pixie and Mockingbird back-to-back weeks, say nothing of like putting Hope Summers and Thanos, but if they had Pixie Mockingbird back-to-back weeks, I would be mad. Like, we've had a lot of good Thanos decks recently. I'd be pretty upset if we had Pixie Mockingbird and Pixie worked with Thanos. As is, I'm moderately upset just considering this, because you saw how excited I was talking about Zoo, right? I can't talk about Zoo, though, because, like, why would, it'll probably make Zoo better, but any amount that it makes Zoo better, it's going to make Thanos even better. So it's not like Zoo is even gaining anything marginally. Thanos just gets another tool, and I really want them to put that no Infinity Stone text on here. Please watch this video and listen to me. Is there anything we can do about it? Next up is Cannonball, a 5/8 with some very confusing text, but basically what he does is he moves a card out of the lane he's played in and replaces it with a rock. If the card can't move, either because, your other lanes are full or the card is blob, it gets destroyed and then replaced with a rock. Right now, this card looks to be the weakest of the cards that is being released in this season. I think that this card would be a great candidate for Series 4, assuming they still are doing that, or a candidate for a late buff, assuming, they're just going to release everything in Series 5, because that's what they did this month, and they probably made more money, and once you start making more money, it's very hard to stop, would be my guess. But I don't get this guy. When I look at him, I think, okay, how is he ever better than Arrow, right? A card that is not very playable, a card that is not very commonly played, a card that is like, I don't know, the 5th or 6th best 5-drop, and I can't figure out how this guy's better. And I kind of wish like maybe they gave him like the Juggernaut ability to hit face down cards. Maybe that would do something, right? Like if you could play him on the final turn and be like, all right, I'm going to knock this guy away. I'm going to use this guy as like a 5-drop Goliath for one lane kind of thing. Like maybe that would be a thing you could do. I don't really think it's going to end up making him better. And I don't really know what would end up making him better. Like this is a card that feels very wordy, very complex, but the ultimate thing that it does is just, oh, it's another 5-drop that has some utility. And I think we have an overwhelming amount of those right now. There are so many just like, oh, I'm a 5-drop and also I do something kind of cool. We have tons of those. There's Legion, there's Arrow, there's Vision. And I just don't know when you'd ever play this over one of those cards. And I think that that ends up taking a very exciting design and reducing it to a relatively unexciting place in the metagame. So I hope they do something about this guy. I don't exactly know what it should be. I will tell you one space that is unoccupied in the metagame right now is just like, there's not a 5-drop that's like 10 plus that people play that isn't Devil Dinosaur or Ronin. So like, if you just made this guy a 5/10, at least there would be some logic behind like, oh, I want to play this guy because of Scar, right? Or maybe a 5/9 even, just like, all right, make him a 5/9. Now he's as big as you possibly can get without getting Shang-Chi'd, and he has this positive ability. Like, at least put him on par with Arrow, because I feel like Arrow's ability is better than this, and she has more power, and I just can't figure out a reason why I'd want to play this guy. War Machine. A 4/6 with an on-reveal ability that says, next turn, nothing can stop you from playing cards anywhere. Now, when I first look at this card, I think, oh, it's like a Storm counter card or a Storm synergy card. But I think it's actually more than that. Like, you first look at this and you're like, okay, this is a card that lets you counter Storm, or this is a card that lets you, like, you play it with your Storm so you can Legion the Storm lane or something weird like that. And I think if that's all it is, this doesn't end up being a very good card. Now, as a 4/6, obviously there's some Zabu synergy. Like, you could just run this guy and be like, I'm never losing the Storm. This is like 4-drop Jeff. I get free wins on, like, Sanctum Sanctorum and stuff like that. And that is definitely true. So I think baseline, he's just pretty good. But I will tell you, there are 2 cards that I think are going to make or break this guy. And I need to know how he works first, because if this card works with the Infinite and works with Ebony Maw, suddenly he is extremely, extremely powerful. I have been thinking of this guy mostly in the context of, oh, he's like, he lets you play anywhere, right? Like, he's like, oh, you can play in a Profex, you can do that. And I think that card is good, but ultimately unexciting. If this card lets you hardcast the Infinite without skipping a turn, and lets you, like, play end of game Ebony Maws, suddenly it becomes a very, very powerful, very, very compelling, already on rate 4-drop. It becomes one of, like, I would say this card becomes maybe competitive with Iron Lad, right? Like, this ends up being extremely relevant. And while I don't know if that kind of stuff will end up being a meta deck, like if you can be the Infinite Ebony Maw, Hope Summers, make it so you can play Infinite and Ebony Maw, what a cool card. If you can do that, then I think that I find it very hard to believe that wouldn't be good. Like, this is the kind of thing where it's just like, oh, I'll just chuck this in whatever. Like, I'll play War Machine, Infinite, Ebony Maw, Hope Summers. Nailed it. That just goes in whatever deck I'm playing, right? Like, that just seems like a very strong thing to be doing. But then you think, like, okay, what decks are already playing Infinite? Is Black Knight going to be able to take advantage of this? Are there going to be some She-Not decks that can take advantage of this? Like, what kind of things will this let you do? And, like, when you think of all the cards in this season, it is kind of bonkers how strong this guy is, because he's probably, like, the 3rd best card in the season. And it's like, this is a card that would have been the best card in a lot of previous seasons if this is how he works. Even if that's not how he works, this is a very, very reasonable to good card that is better than things like Hercules, Meek very easily, and easily competitive with something like Kyera. And if he works with Infinite and Ebony Maw, this is suddenly like, wow, okay, we're really doing something here. And he's like the third best card this season. This is a absolutely nuts season. Like, I cannot stress enough just how crazy these cards are. And that's part of why I wanted to get this video out now. Because we're currently in the middle of a season that is, if we're going to be real, kind of meh. And that's not a problem, right? It's only a problem if you start blowing resources on these cards, not knowing that cards like this are coming out. That's why I'm doing the video right now. So if I had to stack rank these cards, I would say that the best card from this month is probably going to be Hope Summers, followed by Mockingbird, and then War Machine. In fourth place, I have Pixie, but as discussed, the range of outcomes on her is extremely wide. And in fifth place, I have poor Cannonball, who seems to just be worse Arrow or worse Stegron, however you want to phrase it. I don't really know. Probably not worth picking up at any price points, actually. We'll see what they end up doing about that. I personally think that Hope Summers and Mockingbird are like really extremely obviously good. Mockingbird especially in Thanos, but I'll be playing her in other stuff too, but like she's a Thanos card. Hope Summers is like a potential paradigm shift. Like that is a card that is like, that might literally just be everywhere. Like that could just go in like most mid-range decks and Thanos decks for free. Like that's quite powerful. Maybe I haven't even thought about things like She-Not, right? Like you could just do She-Not on turn 6 now. You don't need the magic stuff. You just play a card into Hope Summers and boom. Like that's pretty messed up, right? Like that is quite the thing to do. And so you end up with like a situation where like Hope Summers feels like it's just like you take the top 10 decks right now, she goes in 7 of them and she makes them all better. And that's to say nothing of like, I have no idea what new decks she may create. Mockingbird is just like a 0/9 that goes in Thanos. Obviously good. Thanos is still going to be good. If she ends up in that deck, she ends up being a staple in a very good deck. That's a very free rating for me. War Machine, I think, it does depend on the Infinite Ebony Maw situation. But again, like doing something like Hope Summers into some cards, into War Machine on 5, into the like God roll Infinite Ebony Maw on turn 6 is like, that's very good. That is a very good thing to be doing. And I think generally when I look at this, what I see is the point ceiling of the game going up pretty significantly. Like, these are really strong cards, and I expect to see a lot of high point value games. As far as Pixie, not working with Thanos, I don't know what she ends up looking like. My instinct is she probably could be like a 2-3 without actually hurting that much, but what do I know? When it comes to Cannonball, he is just ass. So, let me know in the comments what you think of my ratings of these March cards, and remember just how good some of these are when you're debating purchasing things like Corvus Glaive. Like, consider that you are effectively trading Corvus Glaive for one of these cards if you're limited on resources, and plan accordingly, basically. Not that Corvus Glaive is bad or anything, but like if you were gonna be picking up Mockingbird or War Machine and instead you picked up Corvus Glaive, I think it's possible you end up feeling bad about that. Of course, I could be wrong. Let me know what you think in the comments. As always, I've been Cam Best. You've been phenomenal. I will see you in the next one.